The opinions expressed in the following video are not in their entirety endorsed by this podcast. They are instead the focus of our discussion today. This is your content warning.
If you grew up in a conservative religious environment, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have some kind of trauma. And this is why. Conservative environments don't allow for free thinking or free expression. They force you to conform to one way of looking, one way of talking, one way of believing, one way of seeing the world. But that's not how most humans function. Most of us are free thinkers. Most of us get curious. Most of us want to express ourselves authentically, and when we do, that often leads us beyond the boundaries of what our organized religion says. When you do begin to express yourself, that community responds with condemnation, with fear, with anger, with the threat of excommunication. And when you're cut off from your community that claims to represent the God who is love, the psychological impact is immeasurable. Religious trauma is real and legitimate.
Hey everybody, welcome to your content warning. I'm Nathan, this is Joshua, and this is a Bible Meets Culture podcast where we discuss the biblical content versus the modern theology of some of the most popular videos on the web right now. Joshua, how are you this morning, sir?
I'm good, man. Good. Glad to be here.
That is awesome. We actually just saw each other last night, so people don't know that, but like we're in separate locations, obviously. But we just saw each other last night, and we thought, let's go back to our houses and record that way.
Yeah, here we are now, three and a half hours away, and we were literally eating supper together last night. What time did you get home?
I got home like 11 o'clock. So
Yeah, okay.
I pulled in my driveway like closer to 10:30, and I didn't actually get to bed till 11 o'clock. So
yeah.
But anyway.
Cool.
It was all good. But as we said, this is episode number 1, right, of Content Week. Brand new podcast that we've decided to do. We're super excited about that. Joshua, go ahead and explain why this is going to be a kind of a longer episode than probably what we're normally going to do, but we want to be sure to clarify some stuff. So explain why we decided to do this.
All right. So you had a podcast when you were at the West Main Church of Christ in Tupelo, Mississippi. I had a YouTube channel called Coffee and Christ. And when you left West Main and went to Troy, and then things for me were starting to come up really busy with life and everything. So it's just funny how God works in different ways, because for me, I wanted to leave the Coffee and Christ YouTube channel, but I didn't want to leave doing online ministry to an extent. And you were looking for some way to get involved at Troy with an online thing. And so we just decided, hey, let's come together and let's talk about some very serious issues. You know, you and I don't shy away from controversy very much. So this is going to be a great opportunity, I think, for us to look at some of the most popular videos that are teaching, in my opinion, and I think in yours too, false doctrine, and understand why it is. But you're going to say, a lot about the people that we're talking about. It's not that we want to come across and condemn. We just want to teach the truth in love. That's really what this is all about.
100%. And, with COVID happening the way that it did, there's so much content. Not that there wasn't a lot of content online before, specifically about things that could have been misleading from a theology standpoint. But with COVID, you literally saw everybody of every belief possible started putting stuff online. And so now there's so much stuff out there. And we just thought this would be a good idea to be able to sit down and go, okay, well, what out there is good, what out there is maybe not so much. And don't get me wrong, nearly every video that we look at, we're probably going to agree with a lot of what they have to say.
Yeah.
And a lot of what they have to say, though, is kind of misleading and can be taken out of context or confused or, quite frankly, misapplied. There are going to be some principles that people come down on and they go, well, this isn't a Christian principle. And when you look at it from a biblical perspective, well, yeah, it's not a Christian principle, but what you're applying it to doesn't make sense either. And so that's going to be kind of a thing. So
no one is wrong 100% of the time. So we have to give credit where credit is due. That's something that we're going to do in this podcast, but we're also going to let the Bible be the authority and hopefully be able to prove from the Bible where some of these people may be mistaken.
Yeah, for sure. So, if you guys are listening to us or you're watching this online, you've probably, I hope that you've already seen the video that we're going to actually be in question today. The video that we're talking about is from a guy named Brandan Robertson. A lot of things that you need to know about Brandon kind of up front. He talks, this particular video that we're talking about, he discusses the topic of religious trauma. And we want to make some things very, very clear. All right. One, this is not us attacking Brandon in any way, form, or fashion, right? Brandon actually, when you look at his videos, some of them are a little bit in your face, right? Because that's, I mean, that's kind of the content that he produces. He's a self-proclaimed progressive Christian, and so he likes to kind of flirt that line of, in your face and being really loving, and that's okay, right? I mean, preachers that do that, from ultra conservative to ultra liberal, if we want to use those terms, that do that. But he seems like, for the most part, really nice guy. He seems pretty calm. He seems pretty level headed. Never met him, but he seems like a nice guy. And so, what we want to really, really, clarify here is that we're not attacking Brandon at all. He just happens to have produced a video that we disagree with, and we're making a podcast about it. That's really all this is, because from his theology perspective, or some of his opinions, we just kind of disagree with. So,
Well,
that's number one.
unfortunately, we live in a culture that says you can't disagree with someone, and if you do, you're condemning them. And
Right.
I think a big part of our podcast is going to be disproving that, to say
Yeah.
we can still disagree, but we're doing it in grace and love and trying to come to
Yeah.
truth.
For sure, man. And I mean, honestly, if Brandon were to ever see this video and he wants to like have a conversation with us, I'd be more than happy to have him on. Really,
Hundred
truly.
percent, 100%.
But it's one of those things that we're not attacking Brandon. We're just disagreeing with his premise. That's
Yeah.
all that is. Secondly, you have to understand that Brandon's a pretty smart guy. All right, you can go and do that research on your own. He's been published several times. He's a big known speaker from the progressive Christian world. He's actually attended a pretty well renowned seminary. And so, he's not somebody that we're like going after because, well, this guy's just ignorant and we don't think he doesn't know what's up. He's a very smart dude. And then lastly, I want to talk about how I think Brandon kind of sets himself up for success in the way that he does this. So if you watch the video or if you heard the clip, this is actually a video from TikTok. Okay, and so one of the premises of TikTok is that the videos are only, I don't know exactly how long it is, but I think this particular one was like 60 seconds, maybe. That's all you get of a clip. And so, what Brandon does is he goes through a lot of stuff in 60 seconds. And the reason that I say he sets himself up for success is because now it's on you and me to interpret kind of what he meant by that and fill in some of those gaps. And so, from Brandon's perspective, he either gets to go, well, no, you misunderstood what I said, or, well, that's not what I meant by that, because there's such a constrained, time frame in which he has to do that. So that being said, we just want to clarify some of that stuff up front before we actually get into the physical video that we'll kind of question about. But just want to make sure everybody understands that we're not attacking people. There will be people on this podcast. We're hoping to do this probably about once a month, just so you guys know.
Hmm.
And then it's one of those things that we're going to have a lot of people that we call into question, and never are we going to be attacking an actual person.
Sure.
We'll come close when we start talking about Steve Anderson, but we're not actually going to attack Steve Anderson. Okay, so that one, Steve Anderson, for those of you that don't know, actually prefers to attack people. So it's kind of one of those give and take things. But anyway, so if you want to at some point, be sure to watch this, like this, share this, and comment on what videos you've seen that you want to question or want us to kind of talk about on this particular podcast. But today we're talking about Brandan Robertson. Brandan Robertson is a self-proclaimed progressive Christian. He is out, I believe, is gay. He does not believe in hell. There are a bunch of things that you need to know about his theology before you kind of break down what he thinks about this. But like I said, he seems like a really nice guy. He's incredibly smart. And he posted a video that we're discussing today that he talked about religious trauma, right? So when you talk about the religious trauma that you see him discuss, there are some things that I think I don't like about his particular argument. And Joshua, I know you kind of made an outline of what his argument said, so I'll go ahead and let you start on that part.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this or watching it, you've probably already seen the video. But to just break it down, he says that if you grew up in a conservative religious environment, it's almost guaranteed you're going to have some kind of religious trauma. And that is, in my opinion, his thesis statement of the whole video.
I got you.
That this is the main point of the video. And he gives several
Thesis.
reasons why you're going to have religious trauma if you grew up. And I love how he put this, not just any religious environment, but in a conservative religious environment.
Yeah, and that was
So,
something that I took note of too, because here's
mhm,
so like that's the general outline of it, right? That's his starting point. That's his first sentence I think he makes in this video.
yeah.
What I don't like about this particular video from Brandon's perspective is he never goes on to define anything that he talks about. So he doesn't define what a conservative religious environment is. He doesn't define what guarantee is. He doesn't define what trauma is.
Hmm.
Right? All these things that he's supposedly saying are a what he calls as an almost guarantee, but he doesn't define any of those. So
Yeah.
and it's one of those things that to me, it seems like there's a lot of, and again, part of the reason that I think he set himself up for success doing this on TikTok, 60 seconds doesn't give you time to define what you mean by conservative religious environment or trauma or whatever that case may be.
Yeah. If I had to take a guess, and that's going to be something that I don't want to do very much in talking
Right.
about somebody else, but I think he's talking about the conservative religious environment here as basically the standard conservative evangelicalism. Basically, what you would look at from the other end of the spectrum, from progressive evangelicalism,
Right.
if that is even considered such a thing. But he says that conservative environments don't allow for free thinking or free expression. They force you to conform. Most humans, by definition, function as free thinkers, as a reflection of God. And so the two then, rather than being that expression of God, rather than being that image bearer, you're being conformed and suppressed. And
Yeah.
really, he says it's a suppression of curiosity. And curiosity is part, I think, of being that reflection of God. And so to suppress that is something that is very problematic for him. He talks about the community, the religious community is supposed to be people who represent a God who is love. And one thing that I really have a problem with, not just with this video, but with progressive Christianity as it exists in the realm of love, is that
Yeah.
they often equate love to equality or love to acceptance. And
Or love to what's the word I'm looking for there? Tolerance.
tolerance, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Tolerance without parameters.
yeah, and
So
that
love
can't.
means yeah. So that I think, and I don't let me put words in your mouth here,
No,
right?
you're
But I
good.
think what you're saying is this idea that when it comes to the conservative Christian realm, love is always equated with you have to tolerate what I'm doing regardless of what your beliefs are.
In the progressive realm, you said
Right.
conservative.
Sorry. So yeah, in the
Yeah,
progressive realm.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
in
That's
the
that's
in the
exactly right.
conservative realm, from Brandon's perspective, it would be the exact opposite, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to do exactly what I tell you to do, otherwise, I'm not going to show you love.
Hmm.
That's kind of the I think the argument that Brandon kind of makes here without really saying that out loud.
Yeah. Well, another problem is if I love you and I see you living in sin, is it really love to allow you to keep living in sin when I can have an impact on you? I would argue it's not. That really, if you see someone living in sin and they're destined for hell, that to not do anything about it is to hate that person because
Yeah.
ultimately they're going to be in an eternity without God. But he
Oh
did say
yeah.
something before I forget finish
Yeah.
my little outline here. He
Yeah.
did
Go
say
for it.
something that I do believe is correct, and he really hit the nail on the head with this, and I don't want to take away from it, and that is that religious trauma is both real and legitimate.
Oh, absolutely.
That
Yeah. No.
100% true.
Yeah.
His reasons for religious trauma, I think, are probably not the same as what I
Oh
might
yeah.
see with someone who was raised in like an abusive cult.
Right.
But um, but it is real and it is
Yeah.
legitimate and
Well, it
it
also
is
depends
something
on how
worth
you
talking
define
about.
cult too, right?
Sure, sure.
But no, I did. Of course, we kind of went through this and we dissected his video, and there were three big things that I completely agree with that he said, and that was one of them. Religious
Hmm.
trauma is absolutely real. Religious trauma is absolutely real, and it is 100% legitimate. My problem is how you define religious trauma, right? Kind of like you said, there's a big difference between the religious trauma that comes from, growing up as a conservative. So, let's just put that in perspective too. You and I are probably both coming from the perspective of we grew up in fairly conservative households, as
Sure.
far as religion goes. And I don't think it's a stretch to also say that both of us probably would be considered more liberal than how we grew up.
100%.
And so that's but when you define trauma, you've got to put a definition around that, right?
Yeah.
That's one of those things. But I do believe that there are people that suffer from religious trauma, and I believe there are people that suffer from religious trauma on the conservative and the progressive end of the spectrum.
Sure.
And so I think that's something that I didn't really like about his video, because I think that there are some really broad generalizations there that he doesn't go into enough detail on. And so it's kind of left up for us to fill in these gaps, so to speak. We kind of
Yeah.
talked about that, but there are these broad, very, very broad generalizations. And one of the reasons that I don't like this particular video, and one of the reasons that I think he does this on purpose, is because if we're talking about these broad generalizations, he never fully commits to one thing or the other, right?
Mhm.
And this is more of an attack, not attack. That's a bad word. This is more of a pet peeve that I have with the comments on his particular video. So if you want to go look up this particular video, it's still on TikTok. All you have to do is go to TikTok, and I think his handle is Rev Brandan Robertson, and you can find this video that he does. But the comment section on this is something that has always been a really, really big pet peeve of mine, because if you go through and you read the comments, and Brandon's kind of interacted with these as well, that his experience is enough to validate his argument, right? His experience of growing up in some form of conservative evangelical environment is enough to validate his argument. And I get that, but what I don't like, and what I see a lot in the comments, and what I see from progressive Christians in general, right? Don't want to make the broad generalizations, but most of most of the progressive Christians that I have dealt with, is that their experience is enough to validate that argument, but yours and mine experience growing up in a conservative environment and not being traumatized by that is not enough to invalidate that argument.
Yeah.
And that, to me, I think is a problem somewhere on the road of trying to bridge that gap, right? Because at some point you've got to understand that, okay, look, and this is, I told myself I was not going to use this phrase, but there are instances where something can be true for you and it doesn't have to be true across the board.
Mhm.
Right. And I don't like the whole your truth, my truth, because, we believe, if we're going to believe the Bible, we believe there is a truth, right?
Sure.
You break that down from scenario to scenario. A grieving period is going to be true regardless of how long you took to grieve over a loss of a loved one, whether it's 3 months or whether it's 6 years. There are things that can be true and for different individuals. So I don't like this whole philosophy that you're going to paint the entire conservative realm based on your experience, but I can't use my experience as a way to invalidate that argument. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm a language nerd. I really,
Yeah,
for those who
Mister,
are
I took
listening who,
Greek for 17 years.
well, still taking it, but like this morning, it's 9:30 in the morning right now for us, and
Right.
I was translating Hebrew at 6:30 this morning for a class.
You're
Um,
such a nerd.
but I am,
If people,
but
like I said, let's pause there for a second. If people wanted to know why are these two guys like making a podcast, what are their qualifications for doing this? Joshua was translating Hebrew at 6:30 in the morning. I don't know what else you need.
well, my point there is that language has a function called conditional statements. And most of the time, it's in a if then pattern. If this, then this. And
Right.
what he does is he says, if you were raised in a
Right.
conservative household, then this is going to be the result.
Almost. Again, he puts that clarification on there, right? He says there's almost a guarantee. Right, so he's not 100% committed. I understand what you're saying. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm not.
But you
But
but you can save your hide really quick by
oh
throwing
yeah,
in a
almost.
caveat like that by
Oh
saying
yeah.
almost or
Well, look, that's why I think
a
Brandon's an
qualifier.
incredibly.
That's the word
I
I'm looking
think,
for.
yeah, I think Brandon's an incredibly smart individual for doing that,
Yeah,
right?
sure,
Because
sure.
guys like me and you now are saying this is what he's saying, And I think anybody that watches this video understands that, I think and I think this is, not trying to speak for Brandon where he hasn't spoken necessarily, but based on a lot of the content that I've seen from him, I think he would admit, sure, you can come out of a conservative religious environment without trauma,
Hmm.
but it's incredibly rare, like almost impossible, I think
Right.
is where he gets that, right? So,
Yep.
when we say this, we're basically operating on what Brandon's content has been throughout the course of his, career, I
And,
guess is
and
what
I
I'm going to say
think
that.
I think too that there's a perspective from him that says if you are currently in a conservative environment, then you are being traumatized without even knowing it.
Yeah, and I think that's a big one. Well, and that's you see that argument from the progressive Christianity movement anyway.
Sure.
Conservatives just don't know any better, and if they would
Hmm.
just be enlightened, if they would just think a
Right.
little bit more, if they would just open their minds a little bit more, they would understand that what they're doing is toxic or
Mhm.
hurtful and don't get me wrong. Look, completely. We had this conversation last night over supper, right? There are absolutely topics that conservative religious environments do not want to have anything to do with, and it has been incredibly harmful
Detrimental
to
to the church.
absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. Okay. So I'm not taking anything like that away from what Brandon is saying because, again, he makes some points. And like I said, one of the things that I agree with in this particular video is there are some, not almost all, okay, there are some conservative environments that are absolutely harmful. There are some conservative environments that do not want you to wander too far outside of a very particular box that they have planted on you, right?
Hmm.
And it's there are some conservative environments that want you to think a very specific way, to dress a very specific way. There are some I know of congregations that, and again, to me, it's not a big deal. To other people, it's a sign of conformity and them putting pressure on you. But I know some churches that don't want you to get in front of the congregation if you're not wearing, khakis or dress slacks and a tucked in shirt. That's just, and you see guys, I've been a part of other congregations where young men have led singing in basketball shorts and tennis shoes. So some conservative environments, I can completely understand where he's coming from. But again, one of the things that I dislike about the video is the broad generalizations that he makes and
Yeah.
saying that this is, 99.99% of all conservative environments are forcing you into this particular box. And I don't agree with that.
Yeah. Sure. There's a book, before we leave this topic and move on,
Yeah.
there's a book called Educated by Tara Westover. It tells her story of how she left the Mormon faith. Um, and,
I bet
and
you that was
she's
interesting.
still a dedicated religious person. I'm not sure if she's still considered Mormon or if she's gone to some evangelical type. But the way she grew up was in a household that didn't believe in any medicine. You used herbal supplements or whatever. Her family lived
Right.
on a junkyard. They didn't go to school. They very what I would refer to as rough individuals, abusive. And when I mean abusive, I'm talking physical, emotional, mental, heinous
Oh yeah.
abuse from a religious perspective. That to me is very different from can I wear shorts to church on Sunday morning or not? As
A hundred
far as
percent.
a conservative, if you want to call it that, mentality. And so I'm
Well,
just
yeah.
adding to our conversation by saying that this whole idea of trauma,
Yeah.
I think some people, even those who are kind of on the fence of do I want to stick with my conservative views or do I want to be more progressive in my line of Christianity, and they're
Right.
wrestling with that, look at trauma in the way that we might view a paper cut.
Right.
Yeah, it might hurt, but it's not going to kill you in the
Yeah.
same way that being physically or emotionally abused in that way
Yeah.
is as
Well,
well.
and like I said, you've got to define conservative Christian
Yeah,
environment or
and
conservative
I think
religious environment.
you have to define trauma.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's kind of one of the first talking points that you made on your particular outline is you've got to be able to define trauma. Are we talking trauma like so? This is one of those like weird sidebars, right? So I started watching a documentary that Leah Remini did on the Church of Scientology, right? Are you talking like the Church of Scientology, like legitimate brainwashing. Once people are out, are forced to be like 100% rejected by their family and forced them to do like unspeakable things. Conservative trauma, or are we talking like, well, Thanksgiving got kind of awkward because I talked about the Holy Spirit and my dad was like, I don't know about that. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not trauma to me.
Yeah.
So
I,
I think defining that's a big, big deal.
I have a note beside this that says Jesus grew up in a conservative religious environment and even fulfilled the most conservative law perfectly.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't think that any of us would suggest that Jesus was a victim of religious trauma. Uh,
Depends on
he,
how you define trauma, right? He kind of technically like, so like let's break this down, right? If he got crucified for his religion, so to speak, that's pretty traumatic. But at the end of the day, it obviously didn't affect him too terribly much because he did what he was supposed to. So
but well, another thing to keep in mind too is that in the minds of the Jews who instigated his crucifixion, they were being religiously morally good. They were
yeah,
trying to defend against blasphemy. And
yeah,
so honestly, we give those Jews a hard time because we say y'all put the Son of God on the cross. Yes, they did, and they should have known, they should have been more faithful and accepting of
right.
Jesus because he proved who he said he was.
Well,
But
it's the same thing that we go with, talking about today, trying to convert somebody. Like you've spent
Mhm,
your entire life being taught one thing is right, one
mhm.
thing is correct. This point is beyond a shadow of a doubt in Bible and can be proven. And now you're asking somebody, and you've got somebody who doesn't believe the same thing, who's been taught the exact same thing. You are 100% right. This is why Scripture says. And those two people meet. Now something's got to give, right? And so I get your perspective for sure. The Jews had been taught from a very, very, I mean, from the time they were born, they've been taught one thing. And now all of a sudden there's this random guy who is basically railing against everything I've ever been taught. I mean, that's a big mindset shift.
Yeah.
Not that it can't be done, because we saw, I mean, you see over and over and over through scripture where it can be done. But again, I kind of see where you're coming from.
But I think that with like the example of Jesus, one thing that keeps coming in my mind is that he obeyed the law perfectly, and the law was the definition of conservative for
Yeah,
them. And
right.
well, what if? And one thing that the video says,
Even
like,
if his teaching, yes, even if his teachings were radical, right? Like Jesus
yeah,
still kept that law perfectly, even though
sure.
his teachings were kind of radical
Well,
based on
Jesus never
the
stops the
environment he
law.
was
He
in.
gives
Yeah,
addition to the law
right,
in a more fulfilling way. So rather than like don't commit adultery, it's if you look at someone with lust in your heart, you have committed
right,
adultery.
right,
Uh, but my point here is that Jesus didn't look at the law as a way to stop his freedom of expression of being an image bearer of God.
right,
So the law condemns against things like homosexuality, adultery, murder. Well, Jesus didn't wake up one day and say, you know what, I really want to kill someone, and the law telling me I can't suppresses me as an individual and my creativity of killing someone.
right.
That doesn't make any sense.
Paints a funny picture, though, doesn't it?
Well, maybe. But,
Sorry.
well, no, I mean,
No, I
it,
understand. I get what you're saying. No, I understand what you're saying. That was
we
funny
look at the
picture.
law, and when I got to be careful about how I define my terms of law. With Jesus, I'm talking
Right,
about the law of Moses, but we look
right,
at the Christian law, the law of liberty in James 2, or the law of freedom as restrictive, when in reality, the definition, the words that are used, the law of liberty, the law of freedom, it's not
right,
restrictive. It's a
right.
freedom from sin.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I think that Brandon doesn't do very well in his argument is that he paints a very, very one-sided picture, right? He presents a lot of very one-sided information. So, he uses that like all those conservative religions environments are going to lead to this. And I don't agree with that. I think some do, right? We talked about
Yeah.
that. Some do, but not all do. He talks about when he goes into kind of that next point you were talking about, he talks about how conservative religious environments are not representative of God, because we serve a God of love and of mercy and of compassion. And that's absolutely true. All right. I want everybody to understand that is absolutely true. You serve a God of love and of grace and of mercy and compassion. But according to scripture, you also serve a God who is jealous, and a God of wrath and of
Mhm.
justice and of perfect wrath and justice and perfect righteousness and all of those things that he expects obedience from you. And that obedience that he expects from you was laid out by him. It's not something that we get to go back and go, well, God loves me, and it's okay. One of the things, not in this particular video, okay, not in this video, but one of the things that you need to understand about Brandon's theology to kind of understand where he's coming from is Brandon doesn't believe in hell. Right. So the idea that there is no hell, and in an interview that he did, I think you can find this on his YouTube channel, maybe. In an interview that he did, somebody asked him, why don't you believe in hell? And his answer was basically summed up as, because he believed that God's grace and that God's love and that God's power was so great that he can save everybody. And so, he thinks it's more in the character of God to love and to save everybody than it is to send people to hell. And I agree that God absolutely has the power and the grace and the love to save everybody. It doesn't mean he's going to,
Yeah.
according to what he says, right? It's not
Right.
like Nathan going, no, you're on there. According to what God says, there is expectation that is involved in your faith to him. And so I think painting that really, really one sided picture is something that Brandon does that I don't like, and that I think is incredibly dangerous when you talk about, because it's easy to focus on God as love, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to go, God loves me. And I think that I think it's unfortunate that because progressive Christians push that so much, I do think it is unfortunate that a lot of times overly conservative Christians don't push it enough, you know. But it is incredibly one-sided. Like, you do serve a God of love. God absolutely loves you. He is willing to give you mercy and grace, but there are obligations that he expects from you.
Yeah.
He is a God of wrath. He is a God of perfect justice, and I think you can't separate those two, right? You cannot separate, well, God may be all these things, but according to what I believe his character to be, I think love trumps the justice part, because
Yeah.
it doesn't work like that.
For the longest time, I thought that when you were saved from hell, you were saved from the power of the devil, and then it basically took literally opening and reading the Bible to find out you're not saved from those things. You're under their power, but you are saved from the wrath of God that
Yeah,
is due you outside of Jesus Christ.
yeah,
So in Christ, we have the love and justification and sanctification that God gives his children. Outside of Christ, we have wrath and justice headed for us, directed
yeah,
at us. And that's a scary thought.
yeah, absolutely. And so I want to bring up this next point, though, because as we're kind of moving through this, we've talked about the kind of the one sided thing of what God looks like. But you put on here this idea, and he does mention this, right? Conservative religion, because that conservative religionism, and this is the part that I don't like, right? Because again, that one sided thing, and you talked about it, that if this happens, then this has to happen. The because conservative religious environments don't believe in love and don't believe in all this, so he makes the form of, they force conformity on you, or that sort of thing. And again, I made it very clear that there are some, I think they're in the minority, of religious environments that do force you into a particular box. Now, I do want us to be very clear that I think that there's a very big difference between forcing somebody to do something and expecting somebody to do something.
Mhm.
So like,
That's a good
I keep
point.
going back to this just because that's what I've been watching lately. But the Church of Scientology, they force, like, they physically will remove you from your bed and drag you into a room and set you down and force you to undergo, I forget what they call it, but it's basically an interrogation. So that they force you. Now, what I want to know from Brandon's perspective is where do you draw the line at they force you to conform versus they just expect you to conform. Now, understand, I'm not defending these things, right? So just because somebody expects you to, show up, I'm trying, I'm going blank on a good example here, right? Just, there are expectations that are not always healthy. Let me put it that way, right? There are expectations. So, like, if you are a part of a, so I use this one, not that I was a part of one, but I know I had several good friends that were part of a fraternity, right? There are certain expectations that come with being a Pike at the University of Tennessee Martin, or the University of Tennessee for that matter, right? There are certain expectations. Not all those expectations are healthy.
Sure.
But generally speaking, you're not physically, I mean, you might be, I don't know, you might be, but generally speaking, you're not physically forced to carry out a lot of what those expectations are. So forcing conformity versus expecting conformity are two very, very different things. So, like, God expects of you certain things,
Mm-hmm.
right? He expects a certain amount of conformity. He expects you to conform to his scheme of salvation, right? He expects you to conform to his standard that he lays out. That's more radical for us than for Christians in general than what the world expects of us. He expects you to conform to certain things, but nowhere does God force you to conform to any of those things. And I think that's something that I do believe that Brandon is correct in saying that, yeah, if you have a conservative environment that forces you, right, that will not let you think freely, I'm not going to say that's a conservative Christian environment. I think it's a conservative environment, but it's not a conservative biblical one. But I don't necessarily believe that the whole you should be free to express yourself however you want in whatever form that you want. I don't think that's a biblical environment as well.
Yeah. So Galatians 6:15 says that there is neither Jew no, there's neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, but new creation in Christ Jesus. And that passage has been on my mind a lot here lately. In a book talking about the unity of Jew and Gentile in Jesus Christ, Paul
Yeah.
says there's no such thing. You're either in Christ or you're not. And
Right.
the illustration that I use in talking about that passage and new creation in general is, we hear it a lot with education because people say, well, you can't expect a fish to climb a tree, and not every student is a cat that can climb a tree. Some of them are fish who will never be able to climb a tree. Well, in the same way, Christians, let's say that the tree is representative of sin or things that are against God, and we're fish. Well, our nature is to not climb the tree. So
Right.
in in Jesus, we are new creation. In new creation, we have a set standard that we must live by. We are changed down to our spiritual DNA. And that standard is not oppressive. The
Right.
standard is what we are called to be part of. It's Romans 6 all day long about leaving the old man in the
Yeah.
grave and having this new life. And that's what we have to do.
No, I completely agree. Like I said, but this whole idea of forcing conformity again, he never defines what that is, right? Like he never. Now, again, I can kind of take a guess based on in an environment that I grew up in. It's expected of you to dress a certain way. It's expected of you to think a certain way. It's expected of you to, I grew up in an environment where there were certain songs in the hymns that we weren't, that were requested that we did not sing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we got up there and sang one, nobody was going to jump up on the pulpit and tackle us and force us to stop. But, it was suggested that we didn't do certain things. And so I think that's got to be an idea of this thing. The other thing that I would say is that I disagree with that he said is you kind of wrote this down too. He makes the comment that conservative religious environments suppress curiosity. And I disagree and agree with this at the same time. Okay. And again, this is difficult because he doesn't define anything. Like he doesn't define what's like, he doesn't even provide any sort of example as what would be an example of suppressing curiosity. Okay. So, like, there are things that, yes, I remember kind of being sidestepped when I was growing up, right? And I was trying to figure out my faith. But a lot of what was being sidestepped was not really important issues, right? So what I'm gonna say 10 to 13-year old hasn't gone, did Adam and Eve have a belly button? Right? That's curiosity. It's pointless curiosity, but it's curiosity. And nobody ever suppressed me going, does Adam and Eve have a, but nobody ever answered it either, right? Because it doesn't matter. A lot of the things that I was curious about that I think might have been suppressed, quote unquote, were things that really didn't make any difference as far as like my salvation goes.
Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit last night.
Hmm.
Adam and Eve versus mankind already dwelling on the earth. And again, there's some credit there, right? There's a specific box that we think in. And when you look at the Bible, you're kind of sitting there, and there are theories that pop up here, there, and yonder, but none of it matters when it comes to your salvation,
Hmm.
right? I think of the idea of the new heaven and new earth. Like, are we going to dwell in a heavenly form, or is it going to be a new physical body that we still physically dwell on? Now, again, not we're bringing that thing up, and that may be touchy to some conservative people that are watching this particular podcast, but it's one of those things that regardless of how I believe what happens after this life doesn't change what I do to make it to where I do have a life after this life. So again, suppressing curiosity is something that, and you wrote down, I think, was it Romans 11:33, right? Is something I think you brought up there. So, but again, I want to know what the definition is, and I want to know when you're suppressing curiosity, is it something that needs to be suppressed, or is it something that doesn't really matter?
Yeah. Well, the thing about curiosity is I think curiosity is an expression of the image of God.
Right.
The curiosity is something that human beings have that none of the other created order has. Not only in the ability to ask logical questions and to try to find logical answers, but even in the realm of art, music, the humans have the ability to create. Right,
Right.
we can
Well, so
create
that's the
art
other
and
part.
music, and that comes from our
Yeah.
our curiosity and our standard
Well,
of that.
and that's the other part. Again, he doesn't define that, right? So when he says there's a suppression of curiosity, is he talking about curiosity from like a secular standpoint? Because I'm curious about music or art or science or whatever the case may be. Is he specifically referring to being curious about your sexuality?
Hmm.
Is he specifically talking about how he's, if I'm starting to view Jesus in a different light than I always have, is that the curiosity that's being suppressed? Like what? And that's why it's difficult, right? But no, I completely agree with you. I think the idea of being curious is something that we have because we were made in the image of God.
And it makes me wonder too, because not this isn't true for everywhere, and I know as times change, church culture changes. But anyone who's ever sat in a high school or younger Bible class, Sunday morning Bible class,
Right.
knows that curiosity is not being suppressed. Those kids will ask questions that no adult would ever think about,
No.
and
Or
especially
would
about
even
the
if they
Bible.
did, yeah, well, say they did think about it, they would never say it out loud,
Yeah, well,
right?
and
And I don't know if
I'm not even talking about the questions like did Adam and Eve have a belly button. I'm
right.
talking
No,
about
I
like
under
real
yeah.
philosophical, theological, eschatological, big $1 million words that we really don't think about a lot.
Yeah. And I agree, man. And that's just one of those things. And so you bring up a good point though, right? Because I think Brandon's philosophy would be, yeah, everybody starts out that way. But the longer you stay in this conservative religious environment, the more suppressed you become to where now you're an adult and you're not asking those questions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like you've just proved Brandon's point correct.
Well,
Um,
but I think that as we get older, and I'm going to shift here from talking about suppression because I don't think it is. I think as
right.
we get older, we get in this mindset that I don't want to learn anymore.
Oh yeah.
I want to just go
Like
in, punch my time card, go to my Bible class, listen to the teacher ramble on for 45 minutes,
yeah.
and then leave and go home.
Well, it's
Whereas,
not it's not a religious thing, right? You
yeah,
naturally, in my opinion, you naturally become less curious about things the older you get.
yeah,
Because the more that you learn, the more that you think you don't really have anything else to learn, and so your curiosity just kind of dies out, right?
which is a
It's
shame.
not be oh absolutely don't get me wrong, it's absolutely a shame, but it's not because you grew up in a religious conservative environment. It's because you got older, and so now you've got more knowledge. And and again, there are some people, don't get me wrong, there are some people out there that would be full-time. Like, if you paid them to go to school for a living, that's what they would do, because they just want to learn everything there possibly is to learn. And then there are some people that just grow out of being curious, out of either fear or out of boredom or out of laziness or whatever the case may be. They just grow out of it. And I don't think it's because of the environment that we're in. I think it's just because we're people, and we naturally get to a point at some point where we just don't care to learn anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I do think that's a good point, though. And again, but I like I said, I keep going back to this whole lack of definition.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go kind of go on to the next point. So we've talked about this idea of he won't define trauma. He doesn't define religious environment. He does make these broad generalizations. We're going to get to one more here in a second. He does present some one-sided information. There's all these things that kind of wrap up in it. But this is the one that I thought stood out to me the most, right? Because he makes this comment, right? I think he wrote down the quote. He says, "When expression is offered, the community," and this is, I've got some problems with this, "the community responds with condemnation, fear, anger, and the threat of excommunication."
Right.
And so, another massively broad generalization. Okay,
Absolutely.
that's a massively broad generalization, and this is one of the things that I don't like about this particular, is because this is the first time in this video that his language and his tone and everything, he seems to separate conservatives from what he would define as real Christians,
Mm.
and that bothered me, and because I think that, I don't think it's true. Now, let me the things I told you, I had down three things that I agreed with him. The one was that religious trauma was real and very legitimate. The other one was that some religious environments do not want you to think outside of a particular box. And the third thing that I completely agree with him on was that some reactions from individuals will be incredibly harsh. And there are times where that harshness is not warranted, and there are times where that harshness is warranted. But I don't like how he made this, because he doesn't define community, right? So what is the community he's referring to? Is he talking about all who identify as conservative Christians? Is he, again, it's such a broad generalization. There's no way to define exactly what he's referring to there. But he says they respond with condemnation, fear, anger, and the threat of excommunication. Um, you know, there are very, very, very few. Now, granted, this whole idea of excommunication, one, this is probably for another podcast, but I don't believe that the fear of excommunication is something that's actually a biblical precedent. Because if you look at, especially, I think it's in First, Second Thessalonians, where you look at where it is laid upon of making a big deal about somebody's sin, you don't cease communication with them, because the text tells you to continue to encourage them to repent. And so the excommunication thing, that again, that's probably a podcast for a completely different time and topic. But
Yeah.
I want to point this out, though. One, I think it's a massive generalization, which I don't like. And two, he doesn't define anything again. But three, I want us to, for like 2 seconds, think about the first time that we've experienced somebody express something completely out the norm. Right. So, if I grew up being taught one very, very, very particular thing, right? Now, does it always lead to condemnation? Does it always lead to anger? Maybe not, maybe it does. But anytime something drastic like that happens to you, those are all 100% natural responses that he seems to clarify as, these are unacceptable responses from a conservative religious environment. So talk about the death of a family member. That is a massive shock. That is something that is expressed in a way that we didn't expect it. And yeah, you get scared and you get angry, right? Those are not unacceptable ways to respond to something. If I've got a 17-month-old son at home. If I raise him the way that I want to raise him, and at 17 years old, he comes to me and goes, "Dad, I'm an alcoholic." I'm like, okay, there's gonna be some fear there, right?
Sure.
There's gonna be some anger, maybe not necessarily at him. Maybe it's because I'm angry at myself or I'm angry at Bud Light. I don't know, but it's just one of those things. So this idea that you can't respond with fear or anger. Now, again, condemnation, I think, is another topic, right? Because it's not on you or me to condemn somebody's soul, right? Now, again, the biggest part that I think that you and I have a beef with when it comes to the progressive Christian environment is I'm not allowed to condemn behavior without condemning a person. Would you agree
Hmm.
with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's something that you've got to separate. I can condemn a behavior. I can hate sin. Doesn't mean I hate the person. And I think that that's completely within the realm of the character of God. So those are some of the things that I don't really like about the way he stated this particular comment. And this kind of came, I think, toward the tail end of his video. And it was one of those things that he very much, made an emphasis on. I think this might have been like the last thing he said before he said religious trauma is real and intimate. And then I'll get to like the last statement that he made that again I think sets him up for just massive success.
Yeah. Well, for what we're talking about here, my understanding of progressive Christianity is that and this is my fundamental problem that I have with progressive Christianity, that they would rather you be happy in your sin
Hmm.
than be a repentant person.
Yeah,
And I told you last night we're studying the book of James on Wednesday nights,
yeah,
and so it's fresh on my mind. But James 5:19, talking about going after someone and trying to bring them back. James five
yeah,
nineteen and 20. My brothers and sisters, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone turns him back, he should know that the one who turns a sinner back from his wandering path will save that person's soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. In other words, it is our charge as Christians to seek after those who are also Christians who are fallen into a life of sin, living an unregenerate and unrepentant life. It's our job to go after them and to teach them in love the way that they should be going in Jesus Christ.
yeah,
Um, Condemnation, I think, is what we think of when we do that, but that's not it.
yeah,
We
no,
are loving them. We're trying to bring them back to a knowledge of truth, to
yeah,
righteousness, and unfortunately, it bothers me to the depth of my soul that someone like is it Brandon or Brendan? I want to
I think it's
mispronounce
Brandon. I
Brandon.
think it's Brandon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, someone like Brandon would say, "Okay, you're living a life of an alcoholic, but you go to church on Sunday morning. That's fine. I don't want to condemn your behavior. You're living, and again, this is a touchy subject, but you're living a homosexual lifestyle. Well, you can be
yeah.
gay and be, well, let me say, I think that you can be gay and be a Christian.
I
Um,
was about to say, let's clarify there.
yeah,
Don't get me wrong. I believe you can identify as a
you
homosexual
can
and
be
be
gay.
a
You
perfect
can be
Christian.
gay and be a
It's
Christian.
the actively
At, right,
homosexual lifestyle
right.
that I have a problem with. So
Struggle.
let's yeah,
Yeah,
we'll clarify some stuff there.
everybody struggles with temptation, and everybody's temptations are different, but acting on them is the
Absolutely.
problem. But let me get
Well,
back
and
to
I
what
don't want to.
let me get
Yeah,
back to what I was
go
saying.
ahead.
You can be acting on your temptation in that way, and he would say that's fine as long as you want to profess Jesus. Well,
Yeah,
you can't profess Jesus, and you can't eat Reese's peanut butter cups all day long for every meal and expect to stay skinny. It's not going
man,
to
I
work,
wish.
don't we?
I was
Though,
like, I wish
but
the
that's the way sin
man.
works. Like we wish that
No,
that
hundred
was the
percent.
case, but it's not.
100%. And look, yeah, and in Brandon's defense, look. So again, we've made this very clear. I hope that we're not attacking Brandon, right? We're not attacking Brandon. This is just some of the philosophies that we think that he's off on. And so I do very much believe that there are some that are out there that a situation would come up and they don't respond correctly. And we get this idea of condemnation, which again, I think one, you kind of talked about, we've misinterpreted a little bit, but
Yeah,
two, we view it as condemnation even in a misinterpreted standpoint because when we try to express the difference of opinion, there's two keys, right? One is we're not allowed to disagree, Like, we live in a culture right now, from a perspective of progressive Christianity, from politics, from whatever the case may be, that you're not really allowed to disagree. You're just supposed to tolerate, right? The other side of that is, there have been, and I would almost guarantee. Again, here we go. I'm saying almost guarantee, right? I would love if Brandon would clarify a very specific instance in his life, because I would be willing to bet that there's one, right, where he expressed a different belief or a different sexuality, and he was met with not condemnation but contempt, right? And there was no love and there was no compassion. And I think that you do see that from all spectrums of the religious environment, that there are going to be those that respond in a way that it's very difficult to see the love, right? There's a way to tell somebody they're wrong and still love them. There's a way to tell somebody that you don't agree with their behavior. And I think too often, and I think this is kind of why he brings up this condemnation and threat of excommunication, right? I think too often you see families, because I know of some, like I have been there. I know of families who have cut off family members completely. They're not allowed in their parents' house because of their lifestyle. And I think that too often you see that be like a first instinct from some, not all. And I think actually probably the minority threaten that excommunication and the condemnation, whatever the case may be. But I think that there are absolutely instances where you see people get scared, and because of that, they react in a very inappropriate way. Now, I want us to be very, very clear, right? And you've kind of hit on it, and I've kind of hit on it. But there is a point, right? There is absolutely a line there where being angry with the sin, right? Putting some limits in place, putting some boundaries in place. There's a point where that's 100% acceptable. And I don't think you can. I don't think you can skirt around that issue. There's a point where that is 100% acceptable. Where that line is, I think, is where people differ in their opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too our biblical understanding of condemnation is lacking. So like John 3:17,
Yeah,
God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through Him. And we say, well,
yeah,
Jesus didn't come to condemn, so neither should we. Well, if Jesus came to condemn, we wouldn't be here because the world would be destroyed like it was in the days of Noah. You know what I'm
right.
saying? Like that's the condemnation that we're talking about here. What I'm doing, or what I think Christians are called to do, is to have a standard of righteousness that we all submit to. And when that standard is not being met, that in Jesus Christ, as brothers and sisters, we admonish and encourage one another to get back to that
Percent.
standard. That's what
Yeah,
I'm saying.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like I said, there are absolutely things that I agree with Brandon in this particular video. And as
Sure.
we kind of wrap up this particular podcast, I hope that we've done a pretty good job of outlining kind of what Brandon said, and where we don't disagree with it. And so when this video goes live, if you have some more questions for us, by all means, put it in the comments. Let us know. We'd love that. The reason, so this is how I'm going to kind of close this, because one, he does close with this statement, right? That religious trauma is real and is legitimate, and that's 100% true.
Yeah.
That is 100% true. Whether or not that is significant trauma, whether or not that is just you, every time you see a book with a last name on it because of who the author is, you shudder a little bit. Like, I have a couple of those. I'm not going to say their names out loud, but I have a couple of those, right? Where
Sure.
if I pick up a book and the author's last name is this particular name, I kind of cringe, right?
Yep.
There are different levels of trauma. It is real, it is legitimate, and I don't want to take anything away from what Brandon is saying, other than the fact that I think he needs to define his terms, and that I think he's misinterpreted a lot of stuff here. But the last thing that I'll say that I think he kind of sets himself up for success, the reason that this entire argument, I believe, is unfortunate, is because this entire argument, the entire thing that he does, is presented on information that you cannot prove.
Yeah.
You can experience it, right? But you cannot prove it. And Brandon even says that when religious trauma has its effect, he says it is immeasurable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he admits this is something that you cannot prove. You cannot quantitate it, I think is the right word there, right? You cannot put a number or an emphasis. Now, if you've experienced rejection from any sort of religious environment and you feel that trauma, right? And again, I'm not, we're trying to kind of stay clear of the whole touchy feely stuff. But you can experience it. I don't want to take that
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
But the reason, the last reason that I kind of have a problem with how Brandon presents this is because he presents this entire argument on a premise that you cannot have any proof for, which I think is really interesting. And again, it kind of goes back to what I said about the people in the comments. Your experience is way more than enough to validate this particular argument that he's making. But my experience, because I don't believe that I believe 100% that I grew up in a conservative religious environment, right?
Sure. 100%.
And I believe 100% that conservative religious environment did not traumatize me for a negative in a negative way in any way, form, or fashion.
Yeah.
But my experience is not enough to invalidate this argument that cannot be proven.
Yeah.
That's kind of my last little pet peeve that I have with this particular case.
So going off of that, my last little pet peeve, and then I guess we can wrap it up.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what you said, but I teach a class at Faulkner University now on Christian ethics, and one of the first things we do is we define where people get their ethical systems from. And
Right.
Is it something relative? Is it something absolute? How do you know? And one of those is called emotivism, which is where your emotions, saying "I feel" or appealing to people's emotions for morality and ethics, is basically rejected by all major philosophies of ethics that are out there.
Right.
Because to give that to your emotions is to give it to something subjective, and that's a whole nother topic. But one way that Brandon sets himself up for success, and all these guys that we're going to talk about for a large majority of these videos,
Oh yeah.
is that they appeal to your emotions. They sit there with
100%.
the solemn music in the background. They got those soft eyes and gentle voice, and they're appealing to your emotions as being compassionate and all of that.
Yeah.
Well, to quote Ben Shapiro, facts don't care about your feelings.
That's very true.
And the point that I'm trying, it's not that feelings are bad. Jesus appeals to people's emotions all the time in the Gospels.
100%. Yeah.
But the point that I'm making here is that we cannot let our I feels trump the Bible's I said.
And
100%. That's what we have to come around to. So whether in talking about trauma, you might say, well, the church told me or taught this and it traumatized me. Well, was it biblical? If it was, then you're the one who has to make the change. If it wasn't, then I sympathize with you and let's work to come to a biblical understanding of what we're supposed to do.
100%. Like I said, and that's kind of how we started this whole thing. That's kind of how we ended this whole thing. Yeah. There's religious trauma out there that exists, and there are things that I believe are taught from pulpits, from classrooms, that have no biblical precedent. We talked about one last night, right?
Yep.
We talked about the whole. Well, I won't get into that, but because that may start some serious backlash. We may address that. If somebody does a video on this particular topic, we'll be sure to cover it. But
anyway, there you go.
So this is kind of why we started the whole podcast, right? We want to be able to separate modern theology and feelings from what biblical content is, right? Yeah. And so I think that's kind of the whole reason we did this. So Joshua, it was great to see you. I know we saw each other last night, but man, I always enjoy getting together with you and doing stuff like this. So as we close out, just so you guys know, if you're ever in Obion County, Tennessee, I am the pulpit preacher at the Troy Church of Christ. We'd be more than happy to have you. If you're ever in, I guess it's Rutherford County.
Rutherford County, Murfreesboro, yeah.
Rutherford County, right? So if you're ever in the Middle Tennessee area looking for a church, Joshua is the associate minister at the Salem Creek Church of Christ, and like I said, we'll probably do this about once a month. If you have videos, if you have questions, be sure to reach out to either one of us. Comment on this particular video. Let us know if there's a clip out there that you've always been super curious about and you want us to address. And man, I'm super looking forward to what this gets to grow into. So,
absolutely.
Thank you so much for being on. Maybe occasionally we'll have a couple more guys on here to talk, but I thought this was a pretty good start for us.
Yeah, man.
Anyway, all right, guys. So until we post another one, we'll see you then. Thank you so much for listening, and this has been your content warning.